a lot of ways in the same ways where we bottleneck our resources and start using them in multiple places, then we're not able to focus on the task at hand. And so that hinders connection. So listening to me is the key one.
Yeah, for me, it's kind of a twofold thing. The first is just openness to having new relationships and fostering and maintaining relationships. And the second part is just a knowledge that connections aren't a one size fits all proposition.
You're listening to Becoming Wildly Resilient, brought to you by University of Kentucky Human Resources, Health and Wellness. In this series, we'll explore a variety of well-being topics with experts from the university community in physical, emotional, nutritional, and financial health. Join us, and together we'll discover how we can thrive at work, home, and beyond. Hey there, listener. I'm Jakob Hester, and I'm so glad you're joining me for another episode of Becoming Wildly Resilient. So when was the last time you felt truly alive, when you were deeply engaged, connected, and focused? You may find that it's been a while, or even if it was fairly recent, it may have been difficult to recall. If either of these describe your experience, you're not alone. As I mentioned in the last episode, some of my colleagues and I recently read a new book from author Catherine Price called The Power of Fun: How to Feel Alive Again. In it, she describes this idea of true fun, which she defines as the magical confluence of playfulness, connection, and flow. She also details why it's essential and how we can set ourselves up for more opportunities to experience true fun. This book resonated so much that I've dedicated 3 episodes to exploring true fun through conversations on playfulness, connection, and flow. This month's episode is on connection, which is the second of the 3-part series. The 2 voices you heard at the beginning are my guests, Drs. Anthony Limperos and Scott Soltis. Anthony is an associate professor in the College of Communication and Information and is the associate dean for graduate programs in communication. Scott is an assistant professor of management in the Gatton College of Business and Economics, as well as the director of the Strategic Human Resources Management Masters and the Human Resources Management Graduate Certificate programs. In this conversation, you'll hear us discuss what it means to feel and be connected, why connections matter and how they've changed in recent years, and how we can cultivate more connection in and out of the workplace. Before you proceed into our conversation, I just want to give you 2 quick reminders. First is to hit the follow button wherever you may be listening so that you don't miss the final conversation on this series, nor any future episodes. The second is to listen through the outro to hear about some additional opportunities to further explore playfulness, connection, and flow from May 9th through the 27th. And now, here's my conversation with Drs. Anthony Limperos and Scott Soltis. Welcome, Dr. Soltis and Limperos. I'm thrilled to have you both on the show because I know you'll both have a unique perspective on the concept of connection. And I know we've spent the first 5 or 10 minutes of our conversation here before we got going, talking about things that we had in common too. So I'm really excited to dive into the topic of connection. So first, can you both just tell our listeners a little about yourselves and what you study?
Sure, I'll go first. I'm Scott Soltis. I'm an assistant professor of management over in the Gatton College here at UK. And I primarily study social networks. So I study people's relationships, especially relationships in the workplace, and how those impact HR-related outcomes like job satisfaction and employee turnover and employee performance. And so how relationships, formal and informal, influence those sorts of things, and how HR can also play a role in influencing relationships and those outcomes as well.
And I'm Anthony Limperos. I'm an associate professor in the College of Communication and Information. And broadly speaking, my research interests focus on the uses and effects of video games and communication technology across entertainment, health, and instructional contexts. So I oftentimes refer to myself as somebody who focuses on media psychology. That's sort of the nomenclature that we use now. More than half of my published articles focus on the effects of video games, and that can be anything from exercise games to pure entertainment-focused games or in-game choices, things of that nature, and how it influences anything from our behaviors to attitudes and cognitions and emotions and things that we might have. But in recent years, and when I say recent years, I'm talking the last 2 to 3 years, I've had a heavier emphasis on looking at information flow and how our news media frames different situations and contexts and so forth, and different stories. And then also how that's sort of complicated by the, I would say, confluence of social media and how that impacts those information flows and how the information gets to us, how we talk about it, and ultimately what we do about it. So more of a, I guess, an agenda setting bent on my research. New unexplored territory for me.
Maybe let our listeners in on a little bit of the conversation that we had right before this.
Yeah, I feel like either one of us could talk because we have a lot of shared interests, as we found out in the first 10 minutes or so. But I'm originally from Pennsylvania, went to Penn State, a big sports fan, big Penn State football fan. I play a lot of video games. So, I'm interested to read more of Anthony's work when we get done here, to see what effects they're maybe having on me, positive or negative. And yeah, I do. And, given I'm a sports fan and I'm an HR person, the natural confluence of those two things is fantasy football. And so I play a lot of fantasy football. I commish a few leagues and always coming up with some new innovative formats there. And I've actually done a little bit of light podcasting around fantasy football too, in some of the different communities that use things like defensive players that require kind of a next level of commitment to really be into it.
Oh, that's awesome. I mean, to me, that's super interesting. And I mean, I was thinking about this when we first started talking, the connection or the personal side of things. And the fact that you're from Western Pennsylvania, I'm actually from Northeast Ohio, the Warren, Youngstown area. That's where I'm originally from, grew up, did my degrees of my undergrad and master's at Kent State. And then I went off to Penn State for my PhD. So we have that in common as well, right? So Penn State football was a big part of my time at Penn State, even though most of it was spent in the library and reading and writing papers and things like that. But yeah, I definitely am not just someone who researches video games. I also play them as well. It's getting a little bit more complicated because I have to compete with a 6 and a 4-year-old. I'll probably talk about them a little bit throughout our conversation today. But now that they play games and they also dominate the screen sometimes, I don't have as much time to play, but I still do play, and I have PlayStation 5 and all that wonderful stuff. So yeah, it should be, for overlapping personal interests, I feel like we need to hang out soon.
Yeah, I agree. And our kids can hang out too, because I have a 7-year-old, and
awesome.
He does the exact same things in terms of taking the TV and dictating what video games we're going to play.
So it's not just
like, hey,
me.
buddy, why don't we pop in Mario Kart this time? And they're like, no, I not really feeling Mario Kart. Let's do Mario Party. All right. I feel like it's kind of worn out at this point, but if that's what you want, then we'll just go with it. And then when he goes to bed, then I'll do Mario Kart, or I'll play something else.
I'm not afraid to admit this, but my son has just smoked me the last couple of times we played Mario Golf. I mean, he's just beat the pants off me. So I guess, it's another humbling experience. I never thought I'd have my kid beating me at games this early in his life. So
Yeah, and I have to note too, for listeners, you all can't see our conversation here, but both of them also have wrestling belts on the shelves behind them. So we found that connection point as well. So, and I will preface this by saying I did not purposely plan any of this. We found all of this out in the process of setting up this conversation. So it's really kind of on a meta level, really interesting that this happened. It worked out really well. So yeah, it'll be kind of fun to dive in. But as I mentioned in the intro, we're continuing our conversation on True Fun today, which author Catherine Price defines as the magical confluence of playfulness, connection, and flow. So can each of you tell us a time, like maybe a recent time, that you experienced playful, connected flow?
Sure. I'll jump right in on this one because it sort of dovetails or piggybacks off of what mentioning my son. And so as you guys know, that since you both have children, the morning can be a chaotic time, right? It's the last time that you're really thinking you can experience any kind of connection or flow because, lunches need to be packed, kids need to be to school on time and things of that nature. So my son's 6 years old. It's his first year of kindergarten. And of course, we think he's very intelligent, but who doesn't think their kid's intelligent, right? Everybody loves their children, right? And they want to, my kid's the best. Yep. So we're those parents at times. And so the other day when we're getting ready in the chaos of everything, he started telling my wife and I that he was really excited about his new sight words for kindergarten. And my wife and I kind of laughed because we're like, he's very advanced in his reading and he knows most of the words already. And so I looked at him and I said, I'm excited that you're excited to learn new stuff and everything like that. And then I said, hey, instead of doing sight words, how about we do mind words? And he looked at me kind of confused and puzzled. And I said, I'll spell words and then you can tell me what they are. So my wife looked at me and she's like, is this really going to work? So like, sure. So the first one I did was bicycle, and I spelled it out, and he thought about it. And he's like, bicycle. And I'm like, yeah, buddy, you got it. And he started screaming with delight. Right. And then my wife's like, oh my God. So like, let's try more of these. Of course, he wanted me to do more words. And so we kept going down. He kept getting one after another. I think he only missed one total, but this went on throughout the rest of the breakfast as we were walking out the door and all the way to school. On the drive to school, we did this the whole time. And so I think I found connection and he found flow in an unexpected place. And it was really fun. We were laughing the whole time. He started trying to throw some at me and started trying to spell some words out. And it just was this happened like last week. And it just kind of exemplified, in my opinion, the characteristics of that sort of situation of playful connection that you can have, even though learning was involved, right? Imagine that.
Yeah, for me, I think back to last week, I had spent some time, and this is a former coworker related story, working on a fantasy football league, because he and I play a lot of fantasy football together. He worked in Gatton for a few years, but he's been at Ohio State now for almost 5 years. But we still find a way to maintain that connection and that friendship, mostly through fantasy football at this point. So last week I had sent him an email of this new crazy league that we had been kicking around. And I finally sat down and put some structure to it and some form. And within 5 minutes of getting the email, he said, hey, let's Zoom. And so we hopped on a Zoom. We started knocking out more details. He would add things. We had this really good flow of ideas back and forth. Whenever we get together in any format, we're always joking around a lot too. So we were laughing, and we had that really nice, fun connection around something like fantasy football. And my wife was working from home that day, and she also used to work with him. And so she was able to come in and, reminisce a little bit and do all of that. So that was a really, really nice, fun, technology mediated interaction, but still had a lot of those same elements. So we were having fun while we were doing it. We were exchanging ideas and coming up with new things while we were doing it. And we were absolutely reconnecting and strengthening and maintaining that relationship that we had.
Yeah, you can see kind of in both of your examples too that they came from simple places for the most part. Like you didn't have to buy anything, or it wasn't like something that was being sold to you. You found them in like these genuine places, and I think that's a kind of a hallmark of true fun, and what we're finding out in the examples that we've already heard in this episode and the previous one too. So as a listener, I want you to kind of take a pause here in a second and kind of think about when the last time was it you had playful connected flow? What did it look like? Where were you? Who were you with? Were there any objects or devices present? When really was that last time, or how frequently do you feel like you're experiencing it? And if you did listen to the first episode and you've already done this practice, think about it since that last episode. When have been those times that have popped up for you of either playfulness or playful connected flow? And really kind of take a moment to think about that. So I'll encourage you to pause and think about that for yourself, and then resume the episode once you've identified those for yourself. So let's jump into connection. Thinking about your respective areas of study, how would you describe what it means to be or feel connected?
Yeah, so for me, it's easier to think of it in terms of being connected than feeling connected. As I mentioned before, I study workplace relationships, and that can be something from I have to work with you in order to get my job done, and so we have a connection through that lens. It could be I consider you to be a friend, and people have friends in the workplace all the time. Or I go to you for advice, or I get information from you. I mean, there's lots of different kinds of connections that we can have in the workplace. And there's lots of different ways that we can also quantify that. And, that's why I said it's hard for me to say what makes people feel connected. I do a lot of studying of the degree to which people are connected. And I map these social structures and see who is more in the core and who might be more peripheral. And if there are subgroups that we can detect from looking at these patterns of relationships. And I can see lots of different metrics about how connected someone is in each of these different networks, and in some cases across multiple networks. But one of the things that we don't do so much is look at what makes someone feel more connected from a relational perspective. We know that relationships have lots of positive affective benefits in terms of satisfaction, commitment, decreased intention to quit, all of those good things that you would expect to come from having some of those benefits. But we don't tap as much into which workplace relationships make you really feel connected, make you feel like you're part of the work environment. We do more, sort of analyzing how to define who is more or less connected and what are the implications of those connections for attitudes and behaviors.
Yeah, I think that's a burgeoning area and in the work that we do as well. We're starting to see more of that like feeling connected versus like the actual sort of like social network structure as well, where it's kind of starting to go beyond that. What about you, Anthony?
Well, I think of it in two different ways as it relates to my research. And I think that the distinction that Scott made between being connected and feeling connected is important because a lot of time the feeling of connection is something I'm studying as an outcome. And so when I say I'm studying it as an outcome, I'm thinking of two specific examples here. And so in my video game research, I tend to bring people to a lab. I have a little lab on campus that's set up like a living room. And I might have them play a certain game, segment of a game, things of that nature, and then ask them questions afterwards. So simple experimental design. And some of the studies, it gets a little bit more complicated than that. But all the things that can facilitate connection in the gaming world, this could be connections between people playing networked games. They could be connections that people have imagined or real with their in-game characters. And what ultimately leads them to feel that connection is something that is important to me from an entertainment context. And I just have to couch this and say it's not that I'm studying it from a marketing perspective that I'm hoping to, go work for a video game company and say, this is what you need to be doing better. Those reward structures that are built into games are incredibly important. They can cross over to be, I don't want to say like bad behavior, but of course, if you're playing too much, people worry about addiction and things of that nature. But what we found, or what I found in a lot of my research, is that there's incredibly important properties within the technology that foster the sense of connection and how people feel connected. And then to pivot over to something that's become more important during the pandemic here is we've done a lot of instructional research. I work with a group here, and everybody knows that we had to pivot very quickly to online learning. But online learning itself is nothing new, right? It's been around for a long time. And people have sort of criticized it. What do they criticize it on its face for? Because you don't have a connection with the person. And how do we foster that sense of connection? And so some of the research that I've done in that area looks at how technological features, and we're talking about very basic stuff, right? So can I see my professor on screen? Am I only hearing audio? Is it narrated over slides? What method is the best way to deliver content for people, from anything from quick recall to their feelings of personal connection that they might have with an instructor? And unfortunately, I don't have the magic bullet, but I can say this. I can say that all of these reports that, the online environment's going to ruin society and ruin kids and ruin everything because it's not effective is not really founded in research. We found that, students can take part in online courses and have that sense of connection and feel connected to the content, to the professor, and actually excel. So those are just two of the ways I feel like my research can fit in with that idea of connection.
Yeah, in the book, The Power of Fun, she describes connection as that feeling of having a special shared experience with someone, and this is sort of the key piece as well, or something else. And so you kind of mentioned that even in the video game world of having like that connection to characters imagined or real, or like the people that you're playing with. So it can go on different levels for sure. And that connection is really, it's an active state, which we talked about in the playfulness episode as well, which really requires you to be engaged. You can't sort of passively sit back and connect with someone. It becomes very challenging to do that. But what we find too is that like most moments of fun, of true fun, rarely occur without other people. And this is true of introverts or extroverts. So you'll hear people say like, I'm introverted. I don't like being around people that much. But it's really like you find different ways to find those connections, and still those moments of true fun for an introvert typically involve someone else. They may just look a little bit different, for example. But if we kind of look on the opposite end as well, you start looking at words like loneliness and isolation and disconnection. And those are words that we've heard a lot lately over the last couple of years as the pandemic took hold and we're kind of stuck in our respective homes and that sort of thing. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of work going into this area, and it's really kind of a timely topic for us as well. So when you all think about connection in your own lives, what kind of initially comes to mind for each of you? What are some of the situations that you feel most connected or are most connected?
I feel like I'm going to be a person of lists here, but there's a few things. The thing I want to start off by saying is my wife, if she were part of this podcast, would tell you that I'm not able to be connected in any way if I am on my phone. That would be her gripe if she were here. However, I play a game on my phone called World of Warships Blitz. Okay. And this game is pretty simple. You're just a little boat, old World War I, II kind of era. And I think it's like, maybe 8 or 9 people on a team. So it's a network game. I just played on my phone, and I feel an incredible sense of connection, not just with the people that I'm playing with, but also with family, because I've gotten some family members into playing it. And then even at times I'll share what I'm doing in that game with other people who don't even know about it, just to see if I can get them interested in the game. And so that's, I can't really explain it. I can explain that when there's events going on and the rewards are greater, I feel more connected and I want to play more. And the more I feel connected, the more I shut other things out, which is like, hey, get off your phone, stop playing that game so you can be connected over here. So that's one place right now where I feel incredibly connected. And then also when it comes to my friends and family, being able to get out and do more. So we were kind of shut-ins during the pandemic. We didn't go and do a lot. We didn't, even though restaurants and bars and places were open, normally places would go, we didn't do any of that stuff. And so in the last month, we've been opening up more, seeing more friends, getting to see family visiting right now. And so some of the characteristics of what's fostered that connection have been, I think, just the familiarity with the environment, the feeling of good times, all these things that sort of seem to, I don't want to say that they were lost, but they were done in a different way, right? They were mediated with technology, doing a lot of technology connections. So I'm not sure if that makes any sense to either of you, but I guess I compartmentalize my family and friends time and the situations, and then the ones that are more connected to the technology is places where I feel connection.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you mentioned like the people and the scenarios or like the places that you find connection for yourself as well. So what about you, Scott?
Yeah, so I actually just had an experience that I haven't been able to have in a while, and I went to an on-campus meeting. And the degree of which I was able to get connection and really even flow and some of these other things there was just remarkable. How much I forgot that can have such an energizing effect. It was a doctoral student who was doing a research presentation, and it was great to be able to be in the room with her while she was doing the presentation and to ask questions and make suggestions. And it wasn't just that too. It wasn't the connection between the presenter and the faculty, but being there and being surrounded by my colleagues and the other doctoral students in the program, and having Steve mention something and then Mikhail take it from there and add something, and then me come in and say, oh yeah, and there's this other stream of research that you should be looking at. And it's just this constant exchange, and how much it's not just us talking for the sake of talking, how it's also helping someone, the person who's doing the presentation, to improve her work. And that, really, not that I was detached in any way from the department, but whenever you've had so much technology mediated communication, just having some of that in person, face to face, can have this really re-engaging effect. And it was really, really an energizing and positive connecting experience. And then on the personal side, it's funny. I was reading. So I haven't read the book, but I read an article from the New York Times in late December by the book's author, Ms. Price. And, she said some of the things that can really get in the way of fun and having these connections and flows and playfulness is time scrolling on phones and, binging shows or things like that. And I read that and I was like, well, that's not how it works for me. I scroll through TikTok, and like anyone who scrolls through TikTok, I say I'm going to do it for 5 minutes, and then a half hour has gone by. But as I'm doing that, I'm like, oh man, my best friend from college would love this. And I know he's not on TikTok. So I find it and I share it with him. Or I go get my wife and I say, hey, this is your grandma. This lady here. This is, this is exactly like her. And so I'm able to find ways to make connections through that. And even through, watching TV shows. I have lots of friends. We have a Succession group me where we talk about Succession after episodes come out. The precursor to that was we had a little Game of Thrones club on campus where, we'd watch the episode, rewatch it, get together on Monday, and then just do these deep dive discussions. I've got a couple of friends in the department and across campus who are big Marvel fans. And so we'll go see the movie in separate little groups and then get together and talk about it. And, those are some really fun connections that can be, mediated through these other things that, could be very lonely events if, you're only ever binging shows by yourself or, scrolling through TikTok endlessly and just not sleeping or not doing work. But there are also things that can lead you to have some of these connections and strengthen some of these connections and use some of these connections in different ways. The people who I do the Marvel things with, one's a neighbor, one's a coworker, one is a friend who is a friend through a shared connection because his wife and my wife are good friends. And so we have, these different types of ties in place already. We're friends or we're colleagues or we're neighbors. But then introducing this other layer to it of these shared interests and conversations around those shared interests, really, in networks, we call that multiplex ties, overlapping ties. But it really strengthens some of those relationships and those connections and keeps things more fun and more free flowing.
Yeah, you made a really important distinction about like technology and how you use it, because you basically mentioned taking what is sort of a passive process and turning it into an active one. So you're like sharing TikTok videos with someone else to make a connection and to laugh together, or you're taking these like movies that you would just kind of go sit and you may find connection with the characters or something like that, but you're taking that a step further and then you're going and having talks about Succession with your friends and stuff like that too. So it's a really good distinction to like not say that all technology is bad or watching TV is bad or being on social media is bad. They're not inherently bad, but it's how you use them and then how you use them to maybe create moments of playfulness, connection, or flow in the future too. So I really, basically what I'm getting out of all of this is like, connection itself even is very, very subjective to the individual, and like where you find connection or where you feel connected is based on what you just like kind of the things you like and that sort of thing. So you may find that it's like in big groups versus small groups or with people you know really well, or you may find that connection more with people you don't know very well. It could be like working in a team or doing a task on your own. It could be leading, it could be teaching it. I mean, there's lots of different ways. And then we kind of take it even further out to things like being connected to, say, nature or a pet, or even your own body through like physical activity. So I think when we initially think about the word connection, it's like person to person that we think about, but there are plenty of other ways for us to feel and be connected. So I think it's, like I said, it was kind of an important distinction to make as well.
Yeah, and I've primarily studied positive relationships in the workplace, but that's not to say that not all connections are positive. Sometimes you can have connections either in the workplace or outside of it that aren't as positive. Just 2 days ago, I posted something to Reddit about the Bengals offensive line, some metrics about how it's improved through free agency, and it got upvotes, and then one person made this really snarky comment, and suddenly I'm Andy Bernard in that episode of The Office where he posts his YouTube performance of him singing, and I'm just stewing over these responses for this stranger. This isn't a connection that I'm making. Well, it's a negative connection because now I'm going to avoid this user, and those sorts of things. And the same thing, I'm sure, Anthony, you've seen plenty of times in not only your study of video games, but in your playing of video games, where people will either just troll or people will just drop out suddenly or not do the role they're supposed to do in team-based games.
Yeah.
And suddenly it starts to create sort of a negative tie. And, it might in some ways strengthen connections among the people who are actually doing things the right way. But relationships can be a double-edged sword, whether they're in person or mediated or with strangers.
And isn't it possible, I want to jump in on that and say it's possible that you sometimes might engage in activities that might be considered objectionable. And so but they create fun for other people. And so when you mentioned the gaming community, of course, we've done studies on gamer tags and the type of, images that people use, right? And those images they use and how they are not necessarily they're laced with profanity, right? And gamer tags and all that stuff. And then what people actually say when they're communicating. So of all games, I was playing the most current PGA game a lot last December. I'm trying to remember what the actual title of it is, but of course I was playing in the network mode. So we're playing versus people, and one guy kept saying the most obnoxious stuff. And so I actually found a loop of politicians saying obnoxious stuff on YouTube. And I just started playing that through my headset. And two of the other people that were part of the group were laughing hysterically. The other guy got really angry. It was like screaming profanity at me. And I'm just like, this is amazing because we have connection, even though I'm doing something bad, the other guy was doing something bad. And it was just completely, harmless stuff, but it created a fun moment for everybody. And, a moment of that guy being a little bit upset with me, but I had a great time. My wife came down and was like, what are you doing? Like, why do you have that blaring? I'm like, don't ask. And I'm just laughing. And I'm like, she's like, golf. I didn't think golf was that exciting. I'm like, it can be.
Yeah. To tie back to the previous episode too, that was in a way you were using a moment of playfulness to kind of build that connection with the other players and to also sort of diffuse the situation of a semi-hostile other player. And it's kind of funny to think about like PGA, which is sort of like the least hostile of sports possible. Like somebody could get that worked up in the middle of a video game about playing one of the like calmest, quietest sports that you can do. It's funny the ways that we find those moments of playfulness or the connection or flow or anything like that. But you all have both kind of jumped into the benefits a little bit. So let's jump into that and kind of talk about what the benefits of connection are. More generally, why would you all say that connection is important? Yeah,
well, connection in the workplace is important. That's what I can mostly speak to, but I have a little bit that gets beyond that too. But some of my own research has shown that having good relationships in the workplace can do things like enhance your ability to perform your job, which is clearly a good thing. Can increase the degree to which you are embedded in your organization and reduce the extent to which you want to leave. So there are those sorts of benefits inside the workplace to connections. Some more recent research we did during the pandemic was looking at how people used networks as a coping mechanism to pandemic-related stressors. And those could have come from, inside the house, work-family conflict, family-work conflict. They could come from things like job insecurity that a lot of people dealt with during the pandemic. The shift to remote work suddenly was another big stressor. And one of the things that we found that people did as a coping mechanism was to reactivate dormant ties. So to reach out to people that they haven't reached out to in a long time. And we found that was a way that people were able to cope with some of these work and non-work stressors, was not just necessarily strengthening their existing network or relying on those ties that they frequently communicate with. But I think we defined it as people you hadn't contacted in 3 or more years. And how many of those folks that you were contacting as you were dealing with these different stressors. And we found that was a really common mechanism that people used to try to cope with some of those different stressors that were occurring at that time. So connections, in and out of the workplace can be really beneficial. There's a model called the job embeddedness model. And one of the cool things about it is it says that, you need to have links in the workplace, but you also need to have links outside of the workplace if you're really going to be embedded in your company, embedded in your organization, embedded in your community, and have all those really positive psychological benefits that links can provide. So, I think there's lots of lots of different benefits that connections can have, attitudinally, behaviorally, performance, all those sorts of things.
Yeah, actually, there's some interesting research that I've recently seen as well from Gallup as far as like connection in the workplace. And they did a really massive study, and they found that those who report they have a best friend in the workplace have higher levels of healthy stress management. They're 21% more likely to feel they had an opportunity to do what they do best every day. And they even had a 41% reduced risk of experiencing burnout. So it's pretty powerful to to just say that you have one single friend at work has this huge benefit on our well-being and on our sort of work experience and what we're able to give, and that engagement that we have with the workplace. And some recent research just within the university as well. On the campus side, we have the UK at Work survey that goes out every other year, and we have a lot of questions that are related to this. And we recently got a chance to see the data from fall of 2021, and it was extremely encouraging for us because we found that two of the top three strengths that were identified, so the questions basically that had the highest percentage of favorable responses, were that respect among colleagues and from supervisors were two of the top three, which is really good for us. And then just a couple notches down from that, we found that 76% felt that they had colleagues they could lean on during difficult or stressful periods. And so that was a vague question. It wasn't really work specific. It was just, do I have someone at work that I feel like I can lean on in difficult or stressful periods, which could be personal or work related. And so for us, kind of knowing what the national data is and seeing what it is here on campus is really, really positive and something that we really want to leverage in the future, because we know it's a strength that we have that you don't necessarily find at other places. And we can use that as a jumping off point to help continue to, get better in some of the other places and some of the opportunities that we have to continue to grow as a university too. What about kind of in your world, Anthony?
Well, I want to piggyback off of what you guys were talking about with the workplace, because there's been an interesting, I guess I would call it a development over the course of my time here. So I got to UK in 2011, and at that time, our college was primarily located in two buildings. And we've seen that kind of go in many different directions over the course of the last 10 years, because we're out of that one building that we were originally in. We're still spread across multiple buildings. And I think that's sort of been the root of some bad things, but also some really, really good things as well. And so when we talk about connection, I think about proximity. I think about all the experiences that I had when I was in graduate school. So since I'm the director of a grad program, it has approximately 70 students in it. My main concern is always the sense of connection that they're feeling with one another, feeling with the rest of the university and so forth. And so something great happened at the beginning of this year coming right out of the pandemic, which was, along with the dean of our college and the chief of staff and other people, we had looked at some space that we had in McVeigh Hall and how we could get all the grad students in McVeigh instead of spread across multiple buildings. And so we thought, while we have faculty spread across multiple places, and that sometimes hinders connection, the least we could do is try to get all the grad students in one space so they could experience that sense of connection, the kind of connection I had when I was in graduate school. I was so fond of, right? Those relational ties that we're talking about, those friendships that end up leading to much more than that, right? Research collaboration, all kinds of great things, feeling like somebody's got your back, all that stuff. And so now we have this year, we have my office and 3 offices, community office spaces in McVeigh Hall, where all the graduate students, all the funded graduate students are located. And it's fostered an amazing sense of connection and community to have everybody in one space. And so I joke with people and tell them that a Monday for me, if I'm in the office early, can be a very interesting day, because I might see 9 or 10 graduate students come by. Hey, can I talk to you about something? Sure, great. And I missed that so much. Right? That wasn't happening right during the pandemic. And when I started being the director of our grad program, I had 1 semester, and then we went fully online, and that was not easy to manage. And so I think that, I guess, as a case study of sorts, and to reference some of the stuff that Scott mentioned, that you mentioned as well, is just, I think that sense of connection that can be felt when you're co-located in the same place and around other people who have common goals and other things that they're working towards is just a really powerful thing. And I'm seeing that play out before my very eyes here just in the last 8 months since we've brought these spaces online and have them being used by all of our grad students. So the one thing I will say, though, is because I'm the only faculty member in my department that's not located in Blazer Hall, sometimes I feel a lack of connection with my colleagues because I only get to see them at faculty meetings or virtually, or if I make the effort to go over there because it is kind of I bet it's about a 15-minute walk, not too terrible. But unless they have a reason to be here, I have a reason to be there. We tend to kind of be like passing. So when I get to see them, it's so exciting. Like I jokingly say when I'm over there for meetings over in Blazer, it's an exciting time because I get to see everybody. So yeah, it's in a lot of ways, a lot of the things that both y'all mentioned are playing out, I guess, in different ways for me, right? So while I might be feeling a little bit less connected right now with my faculty, I'm enjoying being connected with the graduate students and seeing them connect with one another.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I mean, I think it kind of takes it out into that broader conversation of like what does connection do for our well-being? And we're social beings. It's literally wired into us to connect with each other. And you can see that across societies who basically focus on like something like well-being collectively versus as it being like an individual pursuit. And the ones that work together on that pursuit tend to get a little bit further. And we've seen that across time spans, even not just like in our current society or anything like that. But it really helps us flourish as well, which again is kind of the opposite of that languishing, which is again a word that we've heard a lot over the last couple of years with the pandemic, where you're kind of just very indifferent about a lot of things, and you kind of just don't feel like something's there, and you're not as energized, and you don't feel as alive, and those types of things. So those connections can really bring that out of us. But I think another important study that I've seen, there's a really long-running study from Harvard where they've looked at relationships and that type of thing. And they found that those with the strongest relationships lived longer. They reported higher levels of happiness and satisfaction and had less cognitive decline over time. And they realized that relationships ended up having a bigger impact on longevity and happiness than things like money or fame or social class or IQ or our genes even. So it's really interesting to think about like the things that we kind of are taught to, or like are societally embedded in us to pursue, like things like money and fame, are not the things that end up helping us live longer and be happier. It comes down to those relationships, and that's a huge key piece of our well-being and worth really exploring and continuing to put the work into, even as the world continues to change. So there's a really interesting TED Talk from Robert Waldinger, who oversees that study now. So I'll link that in the show notes as well if you want to take a look at that. But yeah, I mean, we know kind of again on the flip side that like social isolation is really, really detrimental to just our health, and it's thought to even be a bigger risk factor than like not being physically active. And loneliness and social isolation have even been compared to the risk level of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So if you kind of put it in that context, like we're pretty well ingrained now in like why smoking cigarettes is bad for us. So if we can think about like basically smoking a pack of cigarettes a day is on kind of the same level as being lonely and isolated, that's a very negative thing to think about. So that, again, on the flip side, shows that social connections can kind of help us limit mental and physical conditions like high blood pressure, heart disease, or obesity, inflammation, depression, Alzheimer's disease. And I mean, there's a really long list that I could probably spend another 5 minutes going through. But it's very, basically relationships are fundamental to our well-being. But we know like the pandemic has really illuminated our desire and our need for connection. So let's talk about some of the potential drivers of connection, how connection and communication have changed, and where we think these might be heading. So first, do the ways that we connect matter? Are there differences between like the types of connection or the modes of communication that we use?
I definitely think so. And this is a tough area to talk about in terms of research because I do follow a lot of the research on the ways that we communicate, right? So what all these new capabilities have brought to us, what has been taken away. And this isn't a new question. This is something that even as far back as I saw one of my former advisors at Kent State had a a study back in like, I think 1990, that was something like, face-to-face or online, are we able to substitute our motives for communicating? If we're communicating in one mode versus the other, do we get the same fulfillment out of them? That's the gist of it. And at that time, they said they're not functional alternatives to one another, right? One is still the gold standard, and we can still consider face-to-face in some ways to be the gold standard. We see that reflected through everybody's comments about education through the pandemic. And so I do think that the technology has opened or broadened our horizons, but I also think that we probably are living in the midst of a cultural shift that we're really not even aware of right now in terms of what the implications might be. And so I do tend to think about the stuff that I've done over the last 2 years. And so one thing that's been nice is we usually get to see all of our colleagues at conferences throughout the year. And since we weren't doing any conferences, there was an event for everybody to have these big Zoom meetings where we got to catch up with folks and things that we wouldn't have done otherwise, because of the pandemic sort of forcing us or bringing upon us that idea that we still want to have connection, but we can't have the traditional kind of connection. And so when I think about the differences between this and the different modes of communication that we use, I mean, we're light years ahead of where we used to be. I mean, even think about the idea of talking on the phone. We jokingly say, who talks on the phone anymore, right? And who do you talk on the phone with when you talk on the phone? But it's kind of like a lost art, isn't it? We're either on Zoom, we're texting, we're emailing, but I don't think I talk on the phone very much, or that was the primary method of communication when I was growing up. And I don't think I'm that old, but I feel quite old. And that's what I'm talking about, that cultural shift that we are experiencing or living in the midst of. And so I do think that in a lot of ways, technology has done a ton to foster our connections and let us have connections we wouldn't have otherwise. Like just 3 weeks ago, had a virtual bourbon tasting with three friends that I usually get together with. But because of different pandemic related stuff that was still lingering and other concerns, we decided to just have a Facebook chat where we're all on there, just talking to one another. And I mean, that's not something anybody would have been interested in. We've had friends move away, and now we do virtual beers. I mean, when was that a thing, right? You don't want to do that, but that's what we do. Now we do it because we're able to do it. And it really is a driver and something that everybody's enjoying, or else we wouldn't do it. So
I think Anthony brings up some good points, and this is definitely an emerging area of research in my field too, where we don't know as much about face-to-face versus virtual. I mean, we've studied things like email communication networks and project team overlaps, some of these other ways that we can define relationships beyond, direct friendships or knowledge sharing and the like. But I think the one place where technology keeps coming up, and it came up in a lot of Anthony's examples, is in time maintenance. So it may be easier for us now to maintain relationships that we already have. Like Anthony, I had virtual beers with some of my old college friends and high school friends at different parts of the pandemic. And I've been able to do different research collaborations more easily with people at other universities and other parts of the country and other parts of the world than I was able to do before. So I can think a lot about some of these relationships that people I maybe just used to only see at a conference. Now I'll have a Zoom happy hour with, or I'll have some project meetings virtually around. But I can't think as much of new relationships that I've formed. So new ties, new relationships, new connections that I've generated through as many of these technology mediated sort of environments. I can think of one where I joined a fantasy football league with a guy in Boston. We didn't know each other, didn't have any mutual friends. He liked some of the things I put in GroupMe, and it led to us having some side conversations and learning we had a lot in common. And so now we've had a couple of Zoom interactions and more emails with each other. And, the modes of communication have expanded. And he's someone that I'd consider a friend now. But he's the N of one that I can think of over the past couple of years in terms of new ties that I've created through this format versus lots of ties that I've been able to maintain in some cases more easily now than before, because there's not pressure to get together. There was an understanding that we couldn't get together for a while. So what could we do instead? And some of those things were a little bit easier. And even when I've had, new coworkers enter into the department, have some of that face-to-face interaction to establish a baseline relationship. And then those relationships have developed more through, technology mediated interaction than the lunches and just stopping down the hallway and talking to each other like we used to. So I think it'll be really interesting to see moving forward the effects on people being able or not able to expand their networks, or maybe even contracting their networks, but also to maintain their relationships and potentially even strengthen some of those existing relationships with some of these new modes of communication.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me to think about, like in the workplace specifically, of like, if you had those ties, you've been with your coworkers for a long time and you had, 10 plus years or whatever in the office together and you know each other really well. I feel like that transition was probably a little easier because you're basically in more of a maintenance mode. And so adjusting to the changing times and switching solely to like technology or anything like that may not be as difficult. But I mean, I've heard stories of people, and I've known people that have started jobs in the pandemic and started like immediately remotely. And like, how do we end up getting those people connected, or how, like, as we kind of bounce between potentially being like in a hybrid world versus an in-person only world versus a virtual only world, there's like all these little nuances now. So are you seeing anything in the research, maybe from the workplace perspective, of like where this might be headed?
Yeah, unfortunately, we haven't seen much of that. One of the things that I'm sure Anthony is really aware of, or maybe it's not as bad in communication, but at least in management and in the type of research we do, there is a significant gap between practice and research. Some of that comes from the fact that we have to get approvals from institutional review boards to conduct research, and then after we get that approval, then we have to collect our data, and after we collect our data, then we have to analyze it, then we have to try to get it published somewhere. So one of the studies that I saw, it's a few years old at this point, but says there's essentially a 7-year gap in a lot of subject areas within management between when something becomes a trend or starts happening in the work environment to when we can actually start seeing some actionable research based out of it.
Yeah, that lag that you talked about with published work is something that we've experienced too. And even not having the background on workplace communication is not being something that I study, I can double down and reaffirm what Scott said. I mean, some of our cutting edge journals, right? So especially computer mediated communication, which is one of the top journals in communications, some of that stuff is taken almost 3 years to get published. And so when you have that kind of a lag, a lot of that scientific work that you're hoping will be out there that can help inform us on how the stuff is working or not working is not going to be seen for a few years.
Yeah, and a little bit of prognosticating that I'm comfortable doing is, we have well-established research that two of the big things that drive new relationships, new connections, are homophily, which is similarity between you and someone else across a wide variety of characteristics, and propinquity, which is that being co-located or being physically close to somebody. And as we've seen a shift away from opportunities for propinquity and being physically located close to somebody, I think we're going to see homophily is going to play a bigger role. And the implication for that is, the initial driver of those homophilous relationships is usually surface level characteristics. People are attracted to others who they see as similar to themselves. And one of the things that I think can be really useful is to just have more information about people out there in terms of things beyond just what you see when you look at them. Like I think about reading Anthony's bio before this started, and I'm like, oh man, we're about the same age, we're from the same area, we have some similar interests. This is someone that I could really get along with. And so, that those homophily effects are likely going to be amplified. And, we don't want a really homogenous workforce where people are only interacting, or even a homogenous culture where people are only interacting with others that are similar to themselves on surface level characteristics, but finding avenues for people to talk about their hobbies or their values or their backgrounds, that might go beyond just that, those surface dimensions, might be something that starts to play a larger and larger role in the ability to form new connections between people when, we're not going to have as much of that co-location or being physically close to each other as we have before, if things continue to persist in terms of the trends of remote work and everything like that.
Yeah. I just want to jump in real quick because you mentioned the two things, propinquity and homophily, as being the things that connect in relationships or what foster new relationships. And we actually did some research. It was actually back when I was at Penn State, but we didn't get it published until years later, but it still got published. And we basically set up an experiment where we were telling people they were using a classroom app to connect with others in a large lecture, but it was really just a shell game we set up, and an experiment like with the manipulation, where we were showing them a Facebook profile with either low, moderate, or high amounts of information. So, you can control what you can put in Facebook, from friend lists to interests and things like that. And this was very early on. This was probably like late 2000s, early Facebook research. And we found that basically homophily was a big driver of what we were setting up here, which is we were telling people they either had to accept this person into their network, or they had a choice to accept or reject their friend request. And I mean, everyone listening out there has probably had situations where they get a friend request from somebody they don't really know, right?
Yep.
And so that token of accepting someone into your network was a driver of feeling closer to them. And of course, this is all survey research, so we're asking the perceptions, but homophily was huge, right? And so we used generic college level information, like what are your favorite shows, music, stuff like that. But we saw that was happening even early on with our social networks. And so I do think that a lot of what Scott said is going to be incredibly important to assess going forward. But I like that overlap. See, not only do we have overlap in our personal backgrounds, but I guess we must have some with our research as well.
Yeah, actually, and I'm like drawing the connection between the two just from personal experience too, thinking about those like friend requests. And like I've gotten much more into LinkedIn lately compared to like some of the other social networks. And mostly because I'm learning more when I'm on there, but that's one that's notorious that you get like random people reaching out to you all the time. And I think about my experience and like, am I going to accept this person or not? And a lot of times it's like proximity actually is one of the like determining factors that I end up having on there, because you can only see so much information for the most part with those requests and everything anyways. But if it's from like somebody that's like not connected to me at all and from like, I don't know, like California or Washington State or somewhere like that, and I'm like, I don't know how you found me. I don't know why. We're not even in the same field of like work or anything. Like I was like, I'm definitely not accepting you, but like somebody who's maybe a little bit closer, that I know they're in Lexington and they work in some semi-related field, but we don't have any connections, I'm much more likely to do that. So like I'm kind of balancing both the like location and sort of the interest or the things that we work on. But yeah, when it comes to like Facebook or something like that, it's, I mean, 99 out of 100 times I'm canceling it if I don't know you, because it's like, it seems creepy in that regard when that happens. But I even think about like, again, kind of bridging the gap between like technology and relationships, like dating, and like how it used to be, and probably similar with like work, like you made these connections with the people that were around you and you had to like seek out what it was that you had in common with each other. And now it's like so much easier to be like, you could be sort of from anywhere and you're connecting now on the interest level as well. So it is really interesting to me to hear about that shift and how both of your all's work tie in together as well. So let's spend the last little bit of our conversation talking about how we can foster more connection in our lives, again, both in and out of the workplace. So again, generally speaking, what tips do you have for strengthening or growing connections in our lives?
My number one thing, and I'm going to try to make this very simple, is listening. And so I think across all platforms, so I'm including face-to-face and I'm including social media, because of course, social media and those ways of connecting, what we call mediated ways of connecting, are pretty much ubiquitous, right? There's nobody that's going to argue that that's not a massive part of our lives and something that's not always going to be. But I feel like, and I've experienced a lot of situations where connection is hindered by lack of listening, lack of understanding, lack of creating what we're talking about today, right? The connection. I feel like the listening is a very important step for creating connection. And of course, anybody can say, well, so is responding, right? But many of us want to respond before we even listen to what others have actually said, right? Because we're just hearing, we're not actually listening. So the reason why I feel so strongly about that is because I am one of those people that if I'm in a faculty meeting and I haven't said anything in 45 minutes, someone will think there's something wrong. Like, are we saying anything you want to relate to? And I'm like, I'm just taking it all in, and I'll respond and we'll create when I can. But to me, we're not doing enough of that across platforms, mostly due to the fact that we're doing so much multitasking. And I've seen the research multitasking in a lot of ways, even though I don't do that work. I've only done multitasking in one particular case, which was we were using a video game simulator to show people how bad they were at distracted driving. And a lot of ways, in the same ways, where when we bottleneck our resources and start using them in multiple places, then we're not able to focus on the task at hand. And so that hinders connection. So listening to me is the key one.
Yeah, for me, it's kind of a twofold thing. The first is just openness to having new relationships and fostering and maintaining relationships. It could be easy to say, well, this person moved away, and we've all, I'm sure, have had friends before who've moved away, and some we've stayed close with, others who we've sort of drifted apart from. And I think an openness to just giving it a trying to maintain some of those relationships, even if there might be some sort of barriers that are around them. And also just openness to, growing your network and trying to make new connections, even with folks who you may not have expected to have a potential connection with. And being able to get outside that's really a comfortable thing for a lot of folks, especially people who are more extroverted. And it might require a little more effort from some other people. But I think having that openness to maintaining or expanding your network, and also sometimes, unfortunately, an openness to realize when you've put enough into a relationship, you're not necessarily getting what you need to get out of it, and an openness to move on from that so that you can invest in higher quality connections in other places is really crucial. And the second part is just a knowledge that connections aren't a one size fits all proposition. Some people will sometimes ask me, what's the ideal network position to be in my organization, or what ties should I create, and what ties should I avoid? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on the culture of your work environment. It depends on the existing network that you have, that you're walking into, what the existing patterns are. And so, for some people thinking about LinkedIn, sending out 15 LinkedIn invites a week is going to result in yielding them one or two new good connections. And that could be great for those folks. For other people, sending out 15 LinkedIn requests is going to seem like a daunting task that's a waste of time. And that's fine for them too. You can build networks lots of different ways to lots of different ends. And that's one of the things that the research has consistently shown is that, hey, there are some real advantages to having a diverse network of people who aren't connected with each other, because you get informational benefits, non-redundancies, and lots of good things can accrue to you there. But there's also some research that shows, hey, if you're part of a densely connected group, that's really good for exchanging complex information and getting things done at a group level. And so, there is no one size fits all best kind of network to have. And again, with all these, network is also something that is very contextual. Your friendship network might be different from your advice seeking network, might be different from your emotional support network. And just knowing that, okay, I can have different kinds of ties. In some places, Jacob, like the research you mentioned, having one relationship is going to serve a huge benefit. So even though I might have one work friend and some of my other colleagues have 7 or 8 work friends, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm at risk for quitting, or that I hate my job, or that I'm not getting some positive effects of those relationships. So, an openness to thinking about networks and relationships, and a knowledge that you're going to get different things out of them, and someone else's ideal network might not be your ideal network in terms of what you can get from it and give to it.
Yeah, kind of back to that subjectivity of it as well, and your kind of own personal experience with it. So we talked about some of those situations where you feel more connected or are more connected. So exploring those and putting yourself in those positions to create more connections because of what you know the ways that work best for you, and really trying to leverage those. And so Catherine Price actually has a fun compatibility quiz that she put together as a resource along with the book. And I'll actually link to that in the show notes as well, because it has sections on playfulness, connection, and flow, and finding those situations and ways that you can find playfulness, connection, and flow. And so it's really important to kind of understand so that you can use those and leverage those, and then use universal skills like being more open and being an active listener, and removing those distractions and those types of things, so that you're really present and have the best opportunity to make a connection. And I guess one other thing I'll reiterate, because I mentioned it in the last episode as well. In the book, she provides kind of a roadmap through the acronym SPARK. So it's making space. So setting aside time potentially to explore connections and sort of putting that physically on your calendar could be a strategy that you use. Pursuing passions, we've kind of mentioned this as well. Like if it's an individual pursuit, a lot of times it still leads to a connection somewhere else, because you guys are talking about wrestling, you're talking about your love of Penn State or something like that. Attracting fun, again, putting yourself in the best position to attract connection as well. Rebelling against things like traditions or the way that you've always done it, stepping outside of that could, again, kind of spark a deeper connection, even with those people that you may have, had a connection with for 20 years or more. And then keeping at it. Again, it's not easy necessarily. It requires us to put in the work, but as we've kind of already discussed, it's worth it. And you have to continue to maintain these, and you do those things by, being more open and listening more and that type of thing. And those are kind of really key fundamental steps that anyone can do as well, and anyone can continue to practice and work on. So what other resources do you all recommend for anyone who may want to dive deeper on this subject of connection?
Yeah, so from my end, I'd recommend. So I didn't mention this earlier, but I do networks research, but I'm a small part of a big networks research team within my department known as the Links Center, and there's several of us who do networks research in a lot of different areas. And if you go on our center website, it's just links.uky.edu. You can find lots of resources about the research that we do. We do an annual workshop in case you're curious about learning more about networks or how to even do some network analysis. We do that every summer, and it's heavily discounted for UK employees. So that's another great way to learn. But links.uky.edu is a great first point for entry of if you're curious to learn more about networks.
I'm over here thinking I might need to take one of those heavily discounted classes.
I was too.
Mine, I guess, are just two book recommendations I have that I'll shout out there. The first one is Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's book on flow. And so if you've never read that original book, Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience, I recommend that one. I did study flow stemming from video games as part of my core research. And so that book was incredibly important for me to read back in the day. And I think it's a good read for people who, we have all heard that quote, find something you love doing, you'll never work a day in your life. That's kind of the essence of what is talking about in that book and explaining through various examples, but a classic in psychology. And then the other one is another book recommendation, and this is actually not meant to be a shameless plug for my friend, but a guy that I went to high school with who's worked in the athletic merchandising and apparel industry for years, basically since we graduated, worked for various big heavyweights like Finish Line, Nike, and so forth. He wrote it's dubbed as a self-help book, but his name is Matt Romancic, and the book is called Sip the Book, and it has a cup of coffee on the front. And it says, sip the book, get a little happier, a little bit healthier, and a little bit wiser, one sip at a time. And so the structure of it's pretty cool. It's like read one page a day, and it's very light reading, but it's an inspirational quote and then sort of a scenario or explanation of that quote or relating some of his own personal experience to it. And so I know he spent a lot of time writing that book, and, those categories are incredibly crowded. And so I bought the book because he was my friend. And then as I read it, I was like, man, other people have to read this too. And so I think it'd be a good one for especially the topic that we're discussing.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll link all of those in the show notes as well. And I may even pick up the book. I've already discussed my love of coffee quite frequently on the podcast. So that's right up my alley. But As our regular listeners know, we have an ever-expanding music playlist that guests and listeners have been contributing to. And now it's your all's turn to add to it. So what song would each of you add that brings about a sense of true fun, connection, or resilience in your life?
Yeah, so I took a peek at the existing playlist and I was able to cross a couple things off the list. Like Three Little Birds is one of those songs that just inherently picks me up whenever I hear it. I used to listen to it on the way to athletic events. My friends were listening to like metal or rap or whatever. I was listening to Three Little Birds. Everything's, don't worry about a thing. And another one that I saw that was already taken was the acoustic version of Times Like These by Foo Fighters, which was my first dance song with my wife. So it's a very strong connecting idea to it too. But going away from those to actually add something new, I try to think about a song that makes a lot of different network connections in my mind activate. And so a few years ago for my birthday, my wife got me concert tickets to a Blink-182 concert in Pittsburgh. And I went, and she didn't just get it for me, she got it with one of my best friends from college. And it was this whole thing they coordinated. And so we went to the concert. It was a great time. And there was a band that was opening for Blink-182 called A Day to Remember that I had never heard of before, but my buddy really loved. And so when I got home, my son, who I think at the time was 5, was like, "Daddy, I want to hear some daddy music." And that's kind of tricky, with uncensored stuff on YouTube Music or wherever, or Spotify. But A Day to Remember has a cover of Kelly Clarkson's "Since You've Been Gone" that he just loves. So when we're driving in the car, still to this day, he asks me to play "Since You've Been Gone." And so it just fosters this connection to my friend in Pennsylvania, this connection I have with my son. And a different cover of that was used in Pitch Perfect, which was one of the first movies my wife and I saw on a date. So it all comes full circle. But Since You've Been Gone by A Day to Remember is my contribution to the playlist that really sparks lots of connections for me.
Excellent. What about you, Anthony?
That is awesome and inspiring. And now I'm over here rethinking my choice because much like you, I do tend to listen, or did and still do listen to, a lot of metal and rap and things like that. The one thing that's changed in my life, of course, is my children and the music that they're interested in. And so I know we can't add a whole album to a playlist, but the movie Encanto, that soundtrack for that movie, is basically on repeat in the car all the time. And that's not actually my choice. I just wanted to mention that because that's what I'm hearing or listening to the most these days. But I actually go to a little bit of a different place. And so the rock band Tool, for those who may or may not be familiar, they have these like lumbering songs that are sometimes like, anywhere from, I think the shortest one might be a 4-minute track to up to, some 18-minute epics and things like that. So they released the most current album was released a couple of years back. And I got a chance to go. It was literally the last concert I went to before the pandemic hit. But there's a song on their newest album called Invincible. And it's interesting that I would recommend that one in terms of fostering a sense of connection, because it's not a sense of connection with others. It's a sense of connection with self, in my opinion. And so the whole shtick with the song is, again, the lyrics, I didn't write it. I don't know what they meant, but I know what they mean to me. It's talking about how people struggle to remain relevant and the tribulations that you go through. I think he's writing it from a perspective of like a warrior. I don't fashion myself as a warrior or anything like that, but there were different times throughout the pandemic where that song meant so much to me and got me going in the morning, because I felt like a lot of us were sort of, this is going to sound really dramatic, but like kind of struggling for our existence. You know what I mean?
Languish.
Like, yeah, exactly. And so that's the one that I'll put on there. So I'll be the guy that has a little bit of a darker metal song on there as being my inspirational one.
Hey, that's all right. I picked a breakup song. So,
that's true.
Gone is about, breaking up with somebody. So it's breaking a connection, but it's I don't know. It's a fun song. And
Yeah, I'm going to listen
all
to
right.
that on the way home now.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite parts of every episode is asking people what songs they would contribute, because if you go look at the playlist, it is very eclectic, and it's all over the place. And I actually had somebody reach out to me about switching it from Spot, because I don't use Spotify, they used another music service, and asked me if I could switch that playlist over to like Apple Music or one of the other services. So I'm actually looking into that, and I'll follow up in the outro with the result of that. But yeah, it's been always really interesting to me because it is subjective. That's the entire point of most of our conversations, even is like our experience is subjective. So how do we make it our own? So we take these concepts that we talk about, turn them into like something that you can take and figure out for yourself. We're not giving you like, you don't need to do this specific thing like X, Y, and Z. It's like, here's a tool for you to use to go on and make it your own. And I think the playlist is kind of that way as well, where it's this is something that works for me. It may not resonate for you, but here are these reasons why this connects. And you heard it in both of your examples. And like on the surface, somebody would have looked at this and said, like, how on earth does this make sense? And for somebody who stumbles across the playlist, half these songs probably don't make any sense at all. And it's probably one of the most eclectic playlists on Spotify right now. But if you listen to these episodes and the reasons why people are choosing these, it makes total sense. And so I have kind of a strong connection to this playlist, and it's definitely a feature I want to keep going for as long as I possibly can, even if it ends up, with 250 songs and it's 7 hours long or something. But yeah, so basically just the last word now. What's the one thing that you hope listeners take away from this conversation?
Just that networks are good, that relationships matter in the workplace. Workplaces are inherently social environments, and everyone's going to fit into those differently, and that there's not one size fits all solution, but just knowing about your network and being open to forming new ties or strengthening ties or uh, reigniting old ties is something that people should have more of.
Yeah, I agree. And I will just say that coming out of the pandemic and thinking about how we create connection and how we have, I guess, what we consider to be optimal experiences with others, I just, I don't know, I'm going to sound like a kind of a classic hippie here, but I just would love for people to take from this to be more kind, be more open, and understanding of the world that we're living in, and to take full advantage of those things that that we've talked about, especially when it comes to networks. Right, there was a point in time when we started doing online communication and forming these online communities that everybody thought this was inherently bad, and there's even published research that says that it's bad. But I think that the voices of positive relationships are speaking a little bit louder. I think the data supports that these networks are incredibly powerful and they can be used for a lot of good. And so, not to steal or double down on what Scott said, but I do think that that's a great thing.
Well, thank you all so much for all your contributions on the show and the connections that we've made, and all the lively conversation as well. So again, I appreciate it and hope to talk to you all again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That'll do it for this second episode in our 3-part series on True Fun. I really enjoyed chatting with Anthony and Scott, and love that a potential personal and professional connection was made in an episode on connection. In the next episode, releasing May 10th, health coach Amy Rodquist Cadet returns to chat about flow and help me close out the conversation on True Fun. Until then, I encourage you to take some time over the next few weeks to focus on your connections. Think about how you are and feel connected. Identify where you might find more meaningful connection, and ask yourself what you need more and less of to make connection happen. As I mentioned in the intro, HR Health and Wellness and Work Life will be teaming up to offer online and in-person experiences to help you rediscover your spark from May 9th through the 27th. You'll find opportunities to further explore playfulness, connection, and flow in your life, including a workshop on creating your own board game, a space to connect over tea, and the return of a family movie night at Gatton Student Center's Worsham Theater. We'll also be out at UK Appreciation Day on Thursday, May 26th, so come see us as we celebrate you. I'll be sharing a link soon to a page where you can find more information and register for these opportunities, so keep an eye on your email and the show notes in the coming days. And speaking of the show notes, I mentioned in the episode that I received a suggestion to copy or transfer the Wildly Resilient music playlist to additional platforms. I'm happy to report that in addition to Spotify, you can now find a Wildly Resilient playlist on Apple Music and YouTube Music. Those links will be in the show notes, along with anything else we mentioned in the episode. I also invite you to check out the HR calendar, where you can browse any additional upcoming work-life and well-being events from University of Kentucky Human Resources. Until next time, take care of yourself and others, and stay well. Thanks for listening to Becoming Wildly Resilient, a podcast series from University of Kentucky Human Resources, Health and Wellness. The UK HR Health and Wellness team, consisting of certified health coaches, fitness experts, registered dietitians, and wellness specialists, offer a wide range of online and in-person programming to University of Kentucky employees, retirees, and their spouses. If you enjoyed this episode, you can listen and subscribe to future episodes wherever you find your podcasts. Connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by searching at UKY Wellness. There, you'll find links to episode show notes and more. You can also email healthandwellness@uky.edu with any questions or suggestions for future episode topics. To learn more about well-being benefits offered by University of Kentucky Human Resources, visit www.uky.edu/hr/wellbeing. Live well.